Hi there, it's Marcus here. Lecture 8, exploring the future senses of voice, or sense of voice, the singular. And for me, this is really where the rubber hits the road. This is where the future senses of memory and foresight come together in you and I, in the way we live our lives, in the way we reflect and sometimes don't reflect, our conditioned responses, fear, anxiety, compulsiveness of different kinds. These sorts of things all play out, and our assumptions about the future get truly tested and, for many of us, exposed. If you're running workshops and so on, this is really where the futurist goes. It's the heartland, you might say, because even if you're working with large organizations, those organizations are composed of individuals, people, you and I. And as such, it's our singular assumptions about the future, our images of the future, as Pollack would put it. And these images are always emotively charged too. That this is where you and I frame the meanings that become collective expressions. Often, let's say in a neoliberal university like the one I'm working in, much is set up in the actual structures, but there's always that human level where you and I can still interfere and mess it up a bit, at least, or ameliorate it, as Marx would say, or perhaps hack it too sometimes to make it work in ways that are truly liberatory in the true educational sense of the term for our colleagues, ourselves, also our students, of course, and possibly also in broader socio-ecological terms as well. So it really does seem to me that this is where, as I said, the rubber hits the road. So let's get going and see what, or how, should I say, this unfolds. It's been a very interesting lecture for me to put together. Basically, I've looked at the kind of resources that have been available to me, often through wonderful and enriching relationships, but it's also very personal. I've been reminded of how many ways in which I practice this future stuff in my own world. Of course, this practicing is always partial. I'm as flawed a human being as anybody else, and that sort of thing. But at the same time, I've been reflecting, because of the nature of this lecture, on my own personal journeys as a person through my life, and as a historian and futurist, cultural being, and so forth. So, last night I went out for a walk in the moonlight on my own, and I took the photograph that's on the front of our slides today. It was a beautiful moon. It's one of those balmy spring nights, the sort of night that you guys in the northern hemisphere would be probably jealous of. 23 degrees or something out there, large bats and other noisy critters moving around, possums and those sorts of things. And I practiced greeting trees and shadows and darkness. I actually encountered a ghost, which I thought was very interesting. He's been there before, but this time he was there very clearly, just for a split second, but enough for me to sort of thank him for being there. No idea what he's doing, he just seems to be standing there. But it means that there are these liminal spaces, and of course full moons or near full moons, moonlight, walking on your own down dark streets, no street lights or anything like that. It means that there are spaces in which more mysterious, more magical things can abide. So, another sip of my drink here, and off we go. I want to start and I end this lecture with reference to a poem. Okay, and I think it's one of those poems that really invites you in. It's by a young poet from English, and a young British poet, Gideon Hugh. I recommend his book to you, The Rumours of Light it is, and this one fell out of that book onto my lap, you might say, just the other day when I was already starting to think about this lecture, and I thought, I've got to start with this. So here we go. So how do we approach voice? And he asked this question: do you think you are self-sufficient? Do you think you are self-made? Do you think you can do it on your own? The air would beg to differ, as would the flesh of the plants and the animals. Let us speak then, and without cynicism, of love. Let us give thanks for that we are not alone, and let us know it deeply. And I think that's part of this thing about voice, is that voice, of course, is about activating our own self as an authentic being, a futures actor, a critical and creative traditionalist, a cultural citizen. But it's also about knowing that we are not alone in this mess, this wonderful and sometimes absolutely terrifying mess of a world. We're seeing so many things that seem to be core human values being flouted. But, this is what life is all about. And there will always be those around us who treat the, human dignity, human value, the value of nature, the beauty of a sunset with contempt. But that's the way it goes. And I want to then turn to a friend of mine, Cynthia Winton Henry, the kind of friend you meet on the way, on the long journey through life. And, she and I have never met face to face, but she's written for me, and I've written for her on occasions as well for different things. And she wrote a lovely piece for my book on Phenomenologies of Grace, the one I edited with Camilla Mazzini-Alistair. And it was a little chapter called Grace Operatives. It was towards the very end of the book. She's talking about her relationship with Phil Porter. And she and he had created this series of, you might call them body wisdom sessions called Interplay. And she says, look, together from 1989 onwards, we taught that that if you can notice sensations of stress, you could also notice the opposite of stress. We call these sensations grace. Grace includes any simple, extraordinary, or beautiful experience of life. Grace works for us because it is a dance word, and both Cynthia and Phil are dancers, a word for deep thanks, hospitality, as well as a source of amazing religious experience. Think of Amazing Grace, for instance, a beautiful song. Grace is similar to aloha, shalom, namaste. We secretly enjoy co-opting and reclaiming grace from its religious use. Once others begin reporting grace in community experiences, we realize that grace is most alive in the group body. What I was saying before, what that poem was saying, we are because everything is, okay? We do not live in a vacuum. We do not live as isolated beings, as much as sometimes our hyper-individuality might encourage us to think so. So she called anybody working in this space, futurists by and large, grace operatives. And I really like that. That stuck with me, that concept. We are grace operatives, especially in potential. But what we are doing through the exploration of the future sense of voice in particular is activating the grace operative in others. Okay, how do we do that? Okay, let's look at that. So, voice dialogue, core part of the way that Sahail Inayatullah thinks of his own processes. He draws on Helen Sidra Stone's work, Voice Dialogue. It's a book. On top of that, I would layer in the following. Arthur Frank's beautiful book, The Wounded Storyteller. I also deeply appreciate the work of Piero Ferrucci on psychosynthesis, which was introduced to me through my friendship with Marilyn Melman, a wonderful, I would say, universal citizen. She lives in Stockholm, and is of British birth. I touch on her work a little bit later, as well as Ferrucci's in this lecture. Rick Rubin, a wonderful guy, written this fantastic book called The Creative Act, which is like a workbook, but it's also like a manifesto. It's well worth looking at. It's a very recent book too, compared to many of these others. I forgot to add dates for these other ones here. Warren Ziegler, 2002, reprinted 2007 or 9, I think. Warren Ziegler's wonderful book, When the Spirit Calls. I've used his work on and off over the years since I came across that. And again, I was introduced to that work via Marilyn Melman's, good advice, you would say. Cynthia Winton Henry, whom I touched on just before, a lovely book called Dance, the Sacred Art. And finally, I want to touch on Nora Bateson's rich work on warm data and this wonderful book that she wrote a few years ago now, Small Arts of Larger Circles. And I want you to remember something. This is from Rick Rubin. Our work embodies a higher purpose. Whether we know it or not, we're conduits for the universe. I like that. Our work, what you and I are on about, what we're doing in this course, what you do in your daily life, making a breakfast or whatever it is for your kids or your partner or just for yourself, patting your dog, stroking your cat, watering the garden or a flower pot if you don't have a garden, all these things are linked to something greater than us. So there is different ways of thinking about this. We are not alone, that Gideon Hugh is touching on in that beautiful extract from his poem, is we are part of things that are cosmic. And from my perspective particularly, but also I think this is key to Future's work, it's an evolutionary perspective. We are growing beings. We are forced to grow when we don't want to, and we're called to grow when we are born, and that calling gets confused and messed up often through our cultural heritages that we inherit, which are always partial and always deeply flawed but deeply enriching. Okay, and there's many things we could say about that. I wanted to say also, and this is one of the reasons why I put this Bodhisattva photograph to accompany this slide, is that there's a whole bunch of Eastern wisdom that can also be drawn upon. And those of you who know me know that I'm particularly influenced by the work of Prabhupada Ranjan Sarkar, but I've drawn on the work of Aurobindo, Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, particularly though they are giants of Indian thought, contemporary or relatively contemporary Indian thought. They all died last century. And of course, then I can go further afield to the Confucian and the Taoist. I can turn to Indigenous Australian as well. I just wanted to flag that this voice dialogue work is quite Western. It's quite focused on the psychological or the psycho-emotional. But for me, and this is where Rubin's going, there is a deeply spiritual dimension to this. And Arthur Frank, the Stones themselves too, of course, Ferrucci, Ziegler, Winton Henry, they are all deeply spiritual people, and they all speak also very directly in their work to the spiritual. But today, and in what we focus on here, the spiritual sits in the back seat. It's quietly humming away there, and it's basically, this is an invitation for you to take this where you want to go, knowing that all of you, even the atheists who may be listening, are deeply spiritual beings. Okay, and that spiritual means relational. It means aware that there is this incredible, rich, what Rubin's talking about there, higher purpose to this universe, that however we want to frame that. Okay, so let's then, if we're going to go somewhere, I think we should turn to the work of Warren Ziegler and his When Your Spirit Calls. Let's have a look at that. So there's purpose and voice. and there's pathways to transformation. Okay, now Ziegler makes this following point. Your beingness, your presence on this planet is not random. He's echoing Rubin, except Rubin wrote his after Ziegler. It is not accidental. You are constitutive of a purpose that transcends your biology and transcends your particular culture and group. That purpose, your purpose, is known by the call of the Spirit, which I now invite you to listen to hear, and to enact in your life. Okay? And I think this is very exciting to think about that this calling, and I've used that term calling many times. I'm not alone in doing that. My good friend Ananta Kumar Giri, who's an Indian scholar of great renown, he has often talked about calling as well in his work, but we can find this all over the place. This calling into the world, that we are born with a purpose, a psycho-spiritual fingerprint. I think that's what the Stones call it from memory, that we are born with this kind of fingerprint that is you and my in our uniqueness. And our giftings are rich, but they often get clouded over, covered over with the cultural conditioning that we are subject to. So, in their book from 1989, Helen Sidra Stone make the following point. We are all raised in cultures and families where we are trained to think, feel, and see in specific, predetermined ways. Don't forget I'm talking about futures feeling, particularly in this series of lectures. Because our learned perceptions are all that we know, we naturally assume that the world around us actually exists as we perceive it, and the self we know is the only one that there is. This is our reality. However, voice dialogue, that's what VD is about accessing other aspects of self that have been denied, suppressed, overlooked in our lives. So if you think about it, I just basically said this just before, we are born into cultures, raised in families, trained, you could say conditioned to think and feel and see in specific predetermined ways. Men are like this, boys like this. Leaders should be like this, let's say macho, strong, muscular, virile, and all the rest, which also means probably male, or they should be kind and benevolent, egalitarian, inclusive, and so on. A much softer version of the leader, a Barack Obama or a Zelensky, or someone like that. So it means, however, that we have work to do, and voice dialogue or voice work in particular, the future sense of voice, we are actually revealing our own voice to ourselves and sharing it with the world in a more effective and authentic way. The Stones go on to say, the concept that we are made up of different selves is sometimes difficult to understand. Some people object to this idea, arguing that such a theory fragments the personality. We feel that it is already fragmented, our personality that is, and our task is to become aware of this fragmentation or multiplicity of selves so that we can make valid choices in our lives. Okay, so it's their work, the voice dialogue work, is actually about allowing voices that have been sidelined, suppressed, voices that we might be fearful of, or might just really feel very uncomfortable in the presence of or dislike. They use the word demonic. Demonic voices are voices that have the demonic potential of a Kali to just wreck, ruin everywhere. Okay? And of course, it's just that it ruins or destroys perhaps stale but stable relationships, or even identity as such. And so there's always a rockiness, a sense of risk, vulnerability in voice work. And of course, as facilitators, we need to be very gentle and supportive, but also very clear about how to support the journey of the opening up to voice dialogue and what its implications are. Yeah. So storytelling to ourselves. This is important. Love this image. Okay, so this is from Frank's work, his Wounded Storyteller. He says, what the story teaches is that there is always another story, and other stories, plural now, have always been possible. One meaning of this lesson is that life is lived in decisions, each setting in place a different way of telling the story, because these stories have consequences. The plot cannot be reversed at will at any point. They are moral. In other words, the stories are moral because they're making sense of the world. And you can't backtrack on the story. If you've been living a story of being a certain kind of man or a certain kind of woman, a certain kind of Westerner or non-Western person, or wherever you sit, okay, you can't go back and unlive the past in any way. We can restory it, and part of what voice work is of course about restoring it, about being able to forgive things that we've done in the past or things that have been done to us in the past, or if not forgive, at least release the emotional static around those things. And so let's keep moving then. Another dimension of this storytelling is the work of Nora Bateson. She gives us warm data. Okay, so these little images here are linked to her website. Okay, then she says, what's warm data? Well, warm data is the relational information. Again, it's about being in parts of groups that describes the many parts of a system. For example, to understand a family, one must understand not only the family members but also the relationships between them, the context they reside in, the ecosystem that shapes them, and that is in turn shaped by them. That is the warm data. And I really like that, and I feel that it's important to understand that warm data workshops, which I've been lucky enough to be part of, are an important part of opening up communities and individuals to voice work, to how do we manage, synthesize, reframe memory, how do we recast it in such a way that our foresight capacity is enriched and that alternatives begin to bubble up around us. So there's the warm data work, and from that, and that's the contextual. We move to Sahel and Ayatollah's work on mantra. The mantra process, he says, helps imagine creating a new future, an authentic future. It adds a feeling dimension to the rational act of creating alternative and preferred futures. And of course, that feeling dimension is key to the future's senses. It's very personal. Mantra is linked to metaphor. It's not the same, of course, as affirmations, for instance, which is a kind of hollow new agey sort of thing. You need to do something if you're going to run affirmations. You need to set up habits, actions, activities, and so on to support them, and then they become more mantric in nature. Mantra also helps us deal with the disowned selves and disowned futures, and that's really key. And Sahel has taken that word disowned from the Helen Sidra Stone's work, where they talk about disowned selves, and that the disowned self is where the demonic might reside, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Mantra can act as compass. It's a way of navigating. So mantra process helps imagine creating a new future. That's what Sahel's saying there, an authentic future, one that's much more aligned with our own aspirations, goals, emotional states, and so on. Mantra is also an orientation to wayfinding. There is a repetitive nature to mantra. Mantra works as a almost like the tick tock, tick tock, tick tock of a clock. It's the habit root or seed that we need to adopt when we are also unleashing new forms, new alternatives for our future. But before we get there, we did need to look more at this disowned stuff. So the disowned and the demonic. Okay, this is from the Helen Sidra Stone's book. They say, look, the disowned self is an energy pattern that is being punished every time it emerged. "You naughty girl, go to your room. You should never," whatever, okay? Whatever the nature of these repressive environmental forces, the result is the same. A set of energy patterns is deemed totally unacceptable and is therefore repressed, but not totally destroyed. These energy patterns live on in the unconscious. They might be feelings of selfishness, they might be feelings that we are not worthy, but they could also be things like senses, our need for gratification, sensory gratification, even sexual gratification. In much of the Western world, sexuality is a double-edged sword, of course. We find it fascinating, but it's often distorted by the media, pornography and so on, and that brings about distortions in our personality, or we suppress it. We feel guilty, especially if your sexuality is not heterosexual, so that your orientation, your core identity itself is being challenged, suppressed, put on the back burner, and so on. So this demonic is that aspect of our deeper self that may threaten to destroy the nice, neat equilibrium of our boring, middle-class, middle-aged life, that sort of thing. Okay, take a breath, move on from the demonic. Love those little guys. We've all got our demons. Have we faced them all? I don't suppose so, because I guess life is about revealing one demon to us after another, making friends with many of them, I think, and at least acknowledging the power and possibly the potency of such so-called demonic forces. So it picks up on metaphor too, voice does. So what are some of the tools that we can bring to this process? And it is a form of self-actualization. I'm using that term in the Maslowian sense there, but so of course we've got the tool of CLA of self. We've explored that already. It's powerful. The Future's Mirror is definitely a way of accessing voices. Journaling is as well, and interplay and so on. Just shut that up for a moment. That was my phone. Journaling, interplay, critique itself, the philosophical, intellectual process of being able to dismantle and reframe dominant narratives in our life. We can also turn to speculative fiction and imagination. Play, of course, is absolutely key. It really dissolves a lot of the static that we might find around voices, voice dialogue and synthesis, psychosynthesis work, the work of the Stones and, of course, Ferrucci as well, which is psychosynthesis. Ritual itself is also deeply important. So these are tools, okay? And the tool, I see them all as in some way touching on metaphors for voice. In putting this lecture together, of course, I was faced with metaphoric contradictions. I realized that at times I use the algorithm as a metaphor for culture, and at other times I use a very organic rhizome sort of approach to culture. Both of them work for me, and both of them make sense, and they speak to, in a sense, the same thing, but through different lenses. I thought I'd bring that up because metaphors in tension are not, they don't cancel one another out. They actually enrich and inform one another. Life is not clean, it's not linear. That's what Laura Bateson points out very clearly in her warm data work. It's relational, ecological, messy, and often quite mysterious. But I was totally thrilled to go, oh my gosh, culture as algorithm. It's a very data, digital-centric, as opposed to culture as rhizome, such an ecological, green, natural way of looking at things, so to speak. That's the analog approach. So you digital versus analog. Both of them work for me because my life stretches between those 2 points, I guess. So let's move on. I want to touch on an article that I just finished writing. It's in press. It's called I Am Mushroom, and it is exploring environmental futures work. through a metaphorical and thoughtful exchange, quite scholarly too, with what would we call it, post-humanist and neo-humanist ways of seeing the world. It's illustrated by my friend Kat McNichol, and here's one of her images here. I am mushroom, and I have this to say: for futures to move from advocacy to transformation, from strategy to wayfaring, we need to lean into methods that tap the power of culture's mycorrhizal depths. Beneath that, turn to digital futurists as hacker understands that culture is alive to innovation, or to innovate on. Okay, we can innovate on it. And then I talk about, in this particular paper, the fungal futurist, the rhizome, and the rich metaphor for the mycorrhizal depths of culture. So here I am, and I'm thinking, and it's quite personal, it's me out walking under the stars and the moon like I was last night, which is where I opened this lecture up. But it's also really important to understand that metaphors are not just out there, we live metaphors. Metaphors actually deeply encode our perceptual ability. They allow some things and disallow other things. And for me, in exploring the fungal, the mycorrhizal, in my own work and in my life, I find that it really does open some fascinating doors for me. Now, we've got to think about choice, because as we do voice work, key to voice work is choice. Do I choose to enact a new metaphor, adopt a new habit, take on a new way of understanding my voice, especially my disowned voices, the shadow voices, if you're going to use a Jungian term? So Elise Boulding makes the point that in her book, which is a fascinating book, The Underside of History, that the problem of history is a problem of selection. In other words, where do we look in history to select stories that are meaningful to the present, okay, and empowering for the future? And I think that's part of it. So there's choice. Which personalities, which parts of ourselves do we are currently privileged, possibly to our own long-term disadvantage? Perhaps you're the good wife or the good daughter, the good father, the good son, the provider, the carer, and you put your own creative and spiritual growth on the back burner, saying, oh, when the family's grown up or whatever, I will be able to get into that much more meaningful, purpose-driven work. So, it's how do we select these things? Maybe we turn that whole story on its head. Pollack, whom I'm obviously quite attached to, makes the following point, that man is always shaping and choosing images of the future. Okay? And that, of course, is everybody. His use of man there is very much mid-20th century. Voice in this context stands between memory and foresight, and it hinges on our worldviews. Voice is subject to the inner struggles between our multiple selves, who might win out on any one day. And I'm just delightfully entranced with the work of Deleuze and Guattari, I've chosen this. I've snipped this page or image from the beginning of their fantastic book, 1,000 Plateaus. They also very much aware of the multiplicity of self or identity, and they say the following. And of course, we also had a very interesting discussion in our recent meeting, our workshop, on counterpoint and music and so on. So there is a hilarious music score for those of you with a musical inclination to just sort of muse over. But anyway, what do these guys have to say? Well, they say this: the two of us wrote Anti-Oedipus together. That was the previous book. Since each of us was several, there were already quite a crowd. Okay, here we have made sense of everything that came within range. That's in this book. What was closest as well as farthest away. We have assigned clever pseudonyms to prevent recognition. Why have we kept our own names though? Or out of habit? Purely as a habit. Okay, to make ourselves unrecognizable in term. In other words, they can hide behind their own names. To render imperceptible not ourselves, but what makes us act, feel, and think. I like that, act, feel, and think. It comes up again and again. So Hal and Tully used it earlier, and so did Pollack and many others. Also, because it's nice to talk like everybody else. I like that. There's this kind of tongue-in-cheekness to say that the sun rises when everybody knows it's only a matter of speaking, because of course the sun doesn't rise, it's the earth that's moving. To reach, not the point where one no longer says I, but the point where it is no longer of any importance whether one says I. In other words, the I becomes almost a meaningless signifier when it's a we. We are no longer ourselves. Each will know his own. We have been aided, inspired, multiplied. So as they've done their philosophical work, they've actually multiplied. They've become more and more. Deeper and deeper voices have been quarried in this magnificent work. It's one of the great works of 20th century philosophy. So back to good old Pollack. So there are 2 points I want to make, and there's this wonderful image that I love to use, past, presents and futures folding in. Okay, the main exercises, can't even read, I'm getting excited here, that man exercises influence over the future through his image of the future is only half the truth. What? Only half? The other half is that the future itself, in its turn, exercises a special influence over man and his image of the future. So, the future works upon the present only to the extent that the present can receive the challenging images broadcast. Man has to be tuned into the right wavelength. Okay, and he concludes the image of the future is the womb. That lovely image again, fertilized by past and future, which bears the history of human civilization. So we find that there is this need to tune into the right wavelength. That's the work of the future sense of voice. We've got memory, we've got foresight, 2 powerful future senses. How do we navigate that? Well, as he says there, the extent that the present can receive the challenging images broadcast. Much of that has been reframed in some respects by talking about, let's say, weak signals. How do we detect weak signals? How do we tune ourselves to pick them out from the big data that we are now receiving on a daily basis and so on? Well, it's an intuitive act. But, we need to tune ourselves. That means to tune our capacity to not just receive, but to shape what we receive, to hear it and to read it in certain ways that empower us, for instance. You all know that I'm not particularly keen on the term Anthropocene. It's simply because it's a closed term. Ecocene, Symbiocene, those sorts of things, terms, I've got to be more precise in my language, those terms are more useful to me because they are much more open and inclusive. Okay, so this is really important. So the image of the future is the womb fertilized by the past and the future, okay, which bears the history of human civilization. And it's you and I that do the mining. We are the archaeologists of the past and the future. And there's something quite poetic about that. I feel poets, of course, who work with metaphor and so on as core work for them, that they are definitely archaeologists of the future, which is why I often turn to poets like Gideon Hugh to help me out, or write my own poetry when I'm stuck. Okay, 2 other points. Responsibility of voice then. What do we make of that? So if Western man now stops thinking and dreaming the materials of new images of the future and attempts to shut himself up in the present out of longing for security and for fear of the future, his civilization will come to an end. 1961, well, I think we're doing a pretty good job of shutting down the future, closing it down anthropocenically, so we need to open ourselves to that. And just on a side, I thought, well, Robert Jung, who's a contemporary of Pollack, he made the important point that there is a possibility of democratization of futures thinking and the social imagination. Even back in the 70s, he was, deeply upset about the fact that You know, the social imagination is deeply shaped by elite culture and elite interests that often silence alternatives and provide us with very powerful and compelling images of specific kinds of futures. Just think of the movie Blade Runner. I love Blade Runner. I'm not criticizing it, but think about the future that it portrayed. Came out when 1980 something, 1, 2, 3, I think, and it was set in 2019, which is now 6 years ago. The LA of 2019, as portrayed in that particular movie, was dark and grim. Okay, and you know, thankfully, the LA of 2019 wasn't anything like that. It was before the halcyon days of COVID, and which is kind of very interesting in itself historically. But I do think that we need to be aware that our voice work, the voice work that we do with ourselves, of course, our families, friends, communities, and of course clients and students and so on, we need to be careful in how we do it. We need to be responsible futurists, you might say, in that space. So I want to turn to my I Am Mushroom again just for a moment, and then we'll have a look at some of the practices, and we can trial some of these practices in our workshops. So here I go. This is my article. As mushroom, voice becomes choice, discernment, a dawning awareness of our own agency. The ability to act grounded in the fungal networks of culture and informed by both memory and foresight. Voice is culture, as each of us expresses it, referring to Vina Duss's paper there. It is what generates the fungal fugue. Again, a musical reference there, counterpoint. Futures work is about enabling each one of us to recognize and operationalize voice. It involves becoming aware of the power of memory and foresight in shaping the narrative possibilities of voice. And voice itself is how we express our own fungal potential. Voice is always the voice of the collective run through our own individual expression. I possibly should have underlined that, eh? This is confusing and confronting, just like what Helen Sidra Stone said about voice dialogue in general, yet it can be comforting. We are not alone. We become together. And in this cooperative act, new stories emerge. Okay, and that's sort of touching the poem from Gideon Hugh and many of the other quotes and statements that have appeared across this course. We are not alone. We are in a co-creative universe, and we are obviously in search of creating new stories. All right, so let's have a look at some of the practices that might come to us here. And this is kind of like a shopping list. It's not particularly well ordered necessarily. I'm not saying that the first one that I show is better than the last one, but they're just the things that popped up as I was thinking about, okay, what are some of the things that I do that we can do? Okay, first of all, I turn to some quite a practical text, and it's more a text that I haven't referenced so far in this lecture. You know, here is the habit of the heart. I have this great book called The Milkwood Permaculture Living Handbook, okay? And in it, they're talking about habits and developing permacultural habits, habits that are enriching for ourselves, for our lives, for our families, and for the earth, because that's what permaculture is linked to. It's about the entanglement of human culture with nature and so on. So one little thing you might want to do. Identify an area in your life that you want to focus on. What is the time frame for this? What is your goal in that? You might not have sat down and thought about this for a long time. So what's an area of your life that you want to focus on? 5-year time frame, next week, today, immediately, whatever. What is your goal? Okay? Write it down. Then make a few copies and post them around your house, or wherever you work as well. The next big decision you come up against, use your stated goal as a test. Do they fit? Does a big decision about should I get a bigger house, should I enter this relationship, a business partnership, or whatever it might be, you know, Does it fit with the goal that you've set yourself? So work on your goal daily. Make it a habit. Voice work needs to be a deep habit forming process for us all. You all know that I've mentioned many times that I've been meditating for years. It's become so much a part of my life. I don't even think about it other than go, oh yeah, I better go and meditate before I do that type thing. And it is purely a habit. I would not be me without it. So from this book, which was written by Kirsten Bradley, she makes this following point. So that was her list. She starts off very early on. Well, I didn't even put page number, page 12, because this is now a quote from that activity that she set us. She said, look, this book is about using permaculture thinking. So I like that, permaculture thinking, to bring small new habits and practices into your daily life that will have meaningful and positive effects, both in ways that you can clearly feel, enjoy and benefit. There's that feeling again, I love it, and benefit from, and in other ways with effects that may be beyond your understanding. Go right back to some of the cultivating ignorance statements from previous lectures and so on, but no less powerful than that. Rick Rubin also says that stuff that we don't understand, but we somehow are called to do it. So this Milkwood Permaculture Living Handbook is a great place to start, simply because it's about enacting voice in one's personal domain, making it very personal. So then my friend Cynthia Henry, Winton Henry, always leaving out the Winton bit, triggering grace. So she talked about grace operatives, right? So she said, look, the formula that she and Phil developed runs like this. Our formula for researching grace is this. First, we do something, you notice the body data as the bits and pieces of moment-to-moment experience. Very much part of the interplay process is this noticing. We become more and more sensitized to our own emotional, physical, cognitive reactions to things, but we also become much more attuned to noticing those very processes also in others. And so we're noticing the body data first, and data leads to information. Oh, I notice that becomes a bit of information, and then it becomes knowledge, which is point 2. Notice body knowledge. That's seeing the patterns of data. This is warm data, as Nora Bateson describes it. What activities, places, and people tend to produce grace in one's body? Feeling of lightness, openness, expansion, possibility, optimism, the next future sense, the bodies of others and the group body itself. So that people tend to produce grace in one's body, the bodies of others, and I see that all the time when I run these kinds of workshops. It's not other people become incredibly grace-filled, and the group body as well, and the entire group takes on almost an identity of its own. And from knowledge we go to wisdom. Okay, body wisdom is choosing these activities for our own good, very much like what the Milkwood book is talking about, Bradley, with her choose a goal, set a goal, and work towards it. I'm going to dance more every day. I'm going to dance to, I don't know, whatever it is that you choose to dance to. Body wisdom is choosing these activities for our own good, the good of others as well, or the planet. Wisdom embraces our willingness to sacrifice momentary pleasure to assume grace for the long haul, to assure it. That means to guarantee that life will be more grace-filled. And she makes this following point, and this is a continuous quote, actually, from her article that she wrote for my book on the phenomenologies of grace. Using body data awareness, we rearrange our birthright practices. Okay? While some were ready to go for it, others needed simpler activities. One-hand dances. I'll talk about that in one of the extra readings that I have attached to this particular week. 3-sentence stories and vocal toning. We joyfully leaned into the purposeless play. It's purposeless play. Okay, we're not doing it to become better, to get happier, or for therapy or anything like that. Interplay is not about therapy. It's about releasing and opening ourselves to possibility. So there is purposeless play and experimentation, affirming everyone for whatever they might notice. We gathered natural skills of easy focus, exclamation, and the joy of being, affirmed in witnessing one another. So there you've got easy focus, exclamation, in sort of taking information. Exclamation is just getting it all out, and through various simple activities where we actually release a lot of the clutter, emotional static energy that often leads to our disowned voices that the Helen Sidra Stones talk about. Okay, very interesting. So you've got a process there. So remember, this section is about some of the processes that I have used and drawn upon in my own work. So then we can turn to Warren Ziegler's book, okay, When the Spirit Calls. And he offers us archetypes, okay. Which archetype do you respond to? And he profiles all of them. And I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to have to scan that chapter, short chapter, where he summarizes, he offers a synopsis of these. And then each chapter in the book is actually an exploration with activities that touch on each one of these. There's the entrepreneurial spirit, sustaining spirit, loving and caring spirit, mending spirit, the just spirit, organizational spirit, enlivening spirit, reflective spirit, and poetic spirit. I've run workshops where I've had these on those terms on various poles, and as we've done movement work and other things, I've invited people to reflect on those spirit positions, those archetypes, and to see which ones they identify with, and so on. It's very, very interesting. So it's absolutely brilliant work, and it's the work actually that Marilyn Melman, as I've already said, introduced me to this. One of the things that I touch on in a moment is work where Marilyn Melman is actually talking about a little bit, going a bit deeper into this inspirited visioning work. But before that, Four Arrows is an American Indian scholar, an indigenous guy, and he's been working for decades now on kinship consciousness, I guess you'd call it. And he says, look, before he starts a workshop, he wanders around, scouts out a place outside where there are trees. Once he knows where that is, he invites, when the workshop is starting, he said to the attendees, let's put your things down on the table and we'll go outside and we'll touch a tree. Step back and count to 10. He calls them together. And he says, ask the attendees to do that again, but this time, ask permission of the tree before you touch it, and you must wait for an answer. People often laugh, he says, and they shake their head and so on, thinking this guy's a bit crazy, but yeah, they sort of submit to it. And then to quote him, when they come back, however, I have done this close to 100 times over the years, there is a different energy. When I ask people to report on the experience, invariably, some will cry. Disbelief is often mentioned, followed by, but I truly felt it, tell me. I conclude the exercise by saying, well, that is how we, as in Indigenous American peoples and other Indigenous peoples, all lived in relationship to other than humans 24/7. And of course, if we go far enough back, our own ancestors did as well. I think that's a beautiful exercise. That was what I was practicing last night as I walked down the street in the moonlight. And it was what opened me to not just the trees and the shadows, but also the fascinating ghost. I'll have to go and ask him what he's doing there, and maybe if he needs help in moving on. But anyway, so let's go to Ferrucci. Let's look for beauty within. So Ferrucci's psychosynthesis work is about integrating those multiple selves or multiple forces, multiple voices, however we want to frame it. And he says this is one of his activities, and there are many activities in his book, at least 2 per chapter. He says, okay, let's contemplate beauty. Okay, think of a trait, a capacity, or an attitude in yourself which you consider beautiful. I've got beautiful eyes, or I'm a beautiful cook, or whatever it is. It does not have to be fully manifest or active. It may be an element still partly concealed in you. Something perhaps only you know about. You might keep it secret because you're shy, you feel vulnerable around it. It may even be the seed of an attitude, a pure possibility. Then he says, take some time to acknowledge and enjoy this element of yourself. So this is what the facilitator is taking people through this process. Then let an image appear to your inner eye that symbolizes what you have chosen. This is the myth metaphor. An object of art, a landscape, an animal, anything. Next step, contemplate that image. Let it show you its own beauty and perhaps even transmit a message. This is the kind of stuff that we do with the future's mirror, which may be either verbal or subtly non-verbal. Any image can actually talk to you if you allow it to do so. Just think of the tree in the previous exercise. Take time to fully assimilate the quality of that image, okay? Now he moves on. Pick another trait, quality, capacity, or side of yourself that you enjoy and repeat steps 2 and 3. Then do the same with still other parts of you which you like. Repeat this same exercise on other occasions until you have come to quite a number of elements in yourself that you appreciate. You'll be surprised at how many you will find, especially if you look deep enough and if you ignore inner voices of discouragement, inferiority, and skepticism. So this is building positive images of self. Okay, so having walked us through that, Ferrucci says the following. How can we further increase our aptitude in the art of appreciating beauty? The answer is ever the same. By learning to be available to it, to be open, to make it a habit. With an open attitude, we calmly take the time to enjoy it. We allow ourselves to absorb it, leaving aside all utilitarian orientation and all impatience. But we can also assume a more active stance and purposefully, almost systematically look for beauty. Look for it everywhere, in a face, in a piece of music, in a tree. I think that is absolutely beautiful. Okay, and moving on from Ferrucci, we'll now come to Marilyn Melman's exercise. This is from a great book. It's a resource that I offer you at the end of this lecture, actually. So she says, look, she's working with Ferrucci's work, but also, and I probably should have put that there, Ziegler's work, even more than Ferrucci's, because she's talking about inspirited visioning. She says, look, listen inward to one's own images of the future, our hopes, fears, expectations that are present, but not necessarily previously recognized or articulated. Listen to other images. So this is the deep listening exercise that she's done. It's a beautiful thing. I've done it multiple times, actually, as a participant as well as a leader, okay? Listen to others' images, usually in threes. Each person is allotted time to describe his or her images while the others deep listen. Identify characteristics of a preferred future and make a personal poster advertising it. So that's where you give it visual form. Visit the poster gallery and reflect on which futures one could happily live in. Okay. From the same book, we get our own Justina Doherty, who has attended sometimes these sessions. She's got a beautiful one on reflection on generational connections and gratitude. And she says, participants start with from reflecting on the memories and feelings about past generations, exploring the connections, okay, they share with them, while connecting with people from the past may be easier. Forming a similar bond with future generations requires deliberate effort. So she talks about, well, let's create a timeline of gratitude. Gosh, I love that. Timeline of gratitude. Start by drawing a simple timeline from today's date. Consider significant individuals from the past, parents, grandparents, siblings, and pets and other significant non-human beings that you remember. Use a collage and old photographs to visually represent these individuals and non-human beings, placing them chronologically on the timeline. I think that's beautiful. And as I was reading that out to you, I was just remembering, because Jane Goodall, the fabulous primatologist and activist, who died very recently, I was listening to a podcast on Being podcast, and in it she was talking about, in her timeline, one thing she remembers was the elm outside her home, which she still lived in as a woman in her late 80s and early 90s or whatever. And this elm, she was talking about it as a young tree, and then in her later years, of course, it was a tree that she lived with all her life. But, she had immense gratitude for that tree. And I think that's really, really important. They're just a few exercises from any number that we could touch on. Here are two books that I've used. So the Justina Doherty's exercise and Marilyn Melman's exercise are found in the green one. Marilyn Melman herself was a lead in a transformative edge, this one here. Both of them are jam-packed with rich resources for voice work. And I have pieces in both, of course, but it's not all about me. It's more about us and resourcing you. And so you can go to their active links. These are, there you go, and this one there, yep, they're active links, free to download, and you can start exploring them. So I promised you that I was going to end with a reflection as well, and not a reflection, a poem as well, drawing from Gideon Hugh. And I really like this one. I love the image that I chose to go with as well. He says, "Turn your gaze upon your soul, for it is time. Look past the shadows, look between the light. It has been waiting for you to step back from the endless undertakings, to take your leave from the busyness and existence, to release, let us say it, the obligations, to realize that you are here." I think that's just beautiful. You are here. We are here. We are here together as individual souls dancing around this great hub and its voice, our own ability to express ourselves. And there's a shopping list of readings for you, just because I can't help myself. And I'm going to pull back for a moment and say, I hope that was useful. We will play with some of those activities and find others to touch upon. To me, this is core business for futurists. Futurists are on about the awarenesses that we bring to our workshops around agency, who we are as individuals, both you and I as workshop leaders perhaps, but also everybody in the room living and finding their way towards greater self-agency, self-authority, self-awareness. So that core ability, as Gideon Hughes says, turn your gaze upon your soul, for it is time. I want to thank you very much, and I hope you do a bit of soul turning and gazing, should I say, turning your gaze onto your own soul. And I look forward to seeing you in the workshops to see how you're faring. Take care.